In July of 1993, a few months after the inauguration of President Bill Clinton, and while the first Jurassic Park was still in theaters, a small group of UFO enthusiasts led a demonstration in front of the White House, demanding UFO transparency. The demonstration was led by a group called Operation Right to Know, and it received a fair amount of mainstream media coverage, especially for the 1990s. Though it may not have had the results some had hoped for, I think Operation Right to Know is still an important chapter in UFO history, worth studying and remembering. For this video, I was able to interview two of the co-founders of Operation Right to Know, Ed Komarek and Mike Jamieson. These days, Ed Komarek lives in the backwoods of Georgia in a cabin he built himself. He has written books on UFOs and forest fire management. And Mike Jamieson runs the website Cosmic Pluralism Studies, which promotes public education on the UFO mystery. I got to ask them about how they got into UFOs, ufology in the 80s and 90s, how Operation Right to Know began, the media coverage it garnered, the impact it had, and their thoughts on recent UFO developments.
The United States government bury reports of unidentified flying objects. Ed Komarek says yes, and that's why he helped start a group called Operation Right to Know
is taking a different approach. Elaine Douglas believes that highly visible demonstrations might broaden public awareness.
But the government kept it a secret, so nobody knew. We're here to let the world know, and we're here to tell the government, no more lies! People have the right to know.
If this group of 100 demonstrators is correct, the U.S. government is covering up the most important secret of all time.
We're not trying to tell people what to believe. We're just trying to get people to look at the evidence.
UFOs, people have the right to know. UFOs, people have the right to know.
You guys were both the co-founders of Operation Right to Know in the 1990s, which was this political activism movement focused around UFOs. So first I would just like to get from both of you, how did you guys get into the subject of UFOs, and what was it like following the subject in the late 80s, early 90s? Where did you guys get your information from? What were the big cases that drew you in, or did you have a sighting? Maybe we want to go Ed first and then Mike.
Okay. With me, it was I was raised by some top ecologists here down in South Georgia, and in 1967 I decided I wanted to go to the University of Alaska, and in 1967, and probably the first winter, it, very cold, 40, 60 below zero. Used to play pool down from college, university down below in Fairbanks, Alaska, which was there was like a line of bars on First Avenue. I think it was First Avenue. And we kids played pool and drank beer there. And one night, or I think it was one morning, I wandered out in the cold and walked down a adjoining street, and there was this little new age bookstore there, and I thought, that's interesting, and so I knocked on the door and went in, and it was just like I felt like right at home. There was like incense and crystals and chimes, and but most important of all, books on UFOs, reincarnation, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, all this sort of stuff. And so I started reading books in all these areas, and then later on, over time, I began concentrating more and more on UFOs because it's one of the things you could kick the tires on, that there were supposedly actually crashed UFOs with that were material and solid and whatever. And so it started so that stimulated my interest. And I studied up on the literature, and sometimes I'd come home after I'd gone a couple years of college up there. I quit, but I would come home and build a small cabin, or what they call a tiny home, and I would spend the winters reading up on all the subject matter, particularly on UFOs. So I got a broad understanding of the whole field in probably around 1969, 1970. And then over time, I went from reading the materials to actually joining MUFON, became a section director, Mutual UFO Network, investigative body. That's an international body. And as a section director, and got some investigative skills involving UFOs. And then I started off my own UFO investigating network within about 30 or 50 miles of where I live here in Southwest Georgia, just in Georgia, north of Tallahassee, Florida. And I started picking up cases about once a week through people who would call me on the telephone. I got messages I got material out in the press and whatever. And there was about, one or two UFOs cited, or some that people had cited a long time before, came out and contacted me by phone. And then I started getting involved with clusters of UFOs north of Cairo that eventually led me to the people that actually claimed contact. And I actually saw a craft myself, and two of the craft followed me home just to see who I was, just because I was sticking my nose into their business. And so they followed me home after midnight and flew off the corner of my property. So I started, I got involved in these counter cases and started having experiences myself. And so I was in contact with Bill Moore, who was an investigator that later got into some trouble with the Benowitz cases, because he was involved with the intelligence community and everything, and cooperating with the intelligence community on this Benowitz case.
Red cutting in here to tell you guys quickly about Bill Moore, an infamous character in UFO history, and the man who connected Ed Komarek and Mike Jamieson. Bill's infamy comes from his willingness to cooperate with intelligence agencies in disseminating known UFO disinformation. Bill Moore came to prominence in the UFO scene by being the first to release a book about Roswell with the release of The Roswell Incident in 1980. According to Moore, this put him on the radar of intelligence agencies. He claims that officials from these agencies offered to share information with him in exchange for cooperation monitoring the UFO community. Moore claims he knew this was a sketch deal, but figured the access he was getting would be valuable to a degree in understanding the UFO cover-up. He felt he could deduce fact from fiction in what the Air Force officers were telling him. Moore was eventually hired by a group of intelligence agents to keep tabs on a UFO researcher named Paul Benowitz, who had been filming experimental aircraft at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. The Air Force ran a psychological profile and disinformation campaign on the unsuspecting physicist, and in return, Air Force intelligence would let Moore in on classified UFO material. This relationship would be exposed at the 1989 MUFON conference in Las Vegas. In what would be one of the most dramatic things to happen at a UFO conference, Bill Moore would announce his role in the disinformation campaign, and the audience was not happy to learn that one of the most prominent UFO researchers was a disinformation agent.
Of my knowledge, it was all disinformation, and I was the unfortunate one who had unwittingly supplied the fuel to those who were spreading the fire. I've held my silence on this matter for more than 6 years. Now you know the truth. Disinformation. Am I currently involved with providing information to any government agency about UFOs or about people involved with the UFO phenomenon? Answer, no. I have not had any such involvement since 1984.
Frankly, I'm a little ashamed of some people in this audience, regardless of what you believe, what you hear, or not.
But I had been interacting with him for quite a while, 2 or 3 years at least, and he was a retired English teacher, and I didn't write, and my spelling was awful. And so I would get on his case about being involved with the intelligence community on this, and he'd send back these corrected letters, with all this red on it, and whatever. And so I was getting his Focus magazine was out, and that's where Mike Jamieson did. Jamieson did an article on political action. He didn't mention the demonstrations, but the first thing that came to my mind was the best way to start off is a demonstration. And so I got through Bill Moore contact with Mike, and I think it was a telephone call, I think, and I said, I'm
more connection. Does that sound good, Mike?
Okay. Yeah. It's my basis for my initial interest. It's the same as Ed's, reading books, in my case, in the early 1960s as a young teen. Mostly read Jim and Coral Lorenzen books, the head of Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, or APRO. The very first major UFO group was in fact theirs, that was formed in 1952.
Here we have objects which are obviously beyond our technology, flying around the skies, occasionally landing, things or entities getting out of them, taking soil samples and vegetable samples, sometimes rabbits or something, whatever they can get their hands on. We ought to know who they are, where they're from, and why they're here.
And I liked reading their paperbacks when I was just a young teen, and I remember really gravitating towards reading about cases of close encounters of the third kind, because there you actually saw the occupants of the craft, So I became more interested in their spin or orientation, as opposed to reading Donald Kehoe so much. He focused on the cover-up issues and sighting cases and the like. And I, unlike Ed, I didn't have a history of UFO sightings, like in the later 60s, or, have a network of people that I became aware of in my own area where there were a cluster of events and encounters. But my interest that was first, created by reading about them and all that, by the time I was entering high school in 1965, I was pretty much convinced we had extraterrestrial visitors here. And, I felt that the close encounter cases actually provided a good glimpse into who was actually here and what they were doing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You guys are both into UFOs while Blue Book was still active, right? Like 1969 is when that closed down, so right in the middle,
yeah.
You guys are.
Yeah, sounds like Mike was in it a little earlier than I was. I think I probably got into it about
when you went to Alaska is when you started reading up on it.
Yeah, 67, 68. For me, you were in it earlier.
Yeah, a little bit earlier, because the paperbacks were very common in those days, and for some reason I just kind of started gravitating towards reading about that. And my interest would flare up over the years when there would be events, in the news or movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind in the late 70s.
Well, Mike, quick question too. Was there a particular close encounter case or a few that you liked or that you thought people should learn more about from that time period that really interested you?
I can really vividly remember encountering the Antonio Villas-Boas case from South America. That case is where he was taken aboard a craft and he had a very intimate encounter with semi-alien, semi-human type entity, female entity, and all that. And of course, that was a case that the Lorenzens were very reluctant to publicize over here, even though they had a consultant doctor down there dealing with the case who had a long deposition taken of the guy with the lawyer present and a newspaper reporter present. It was controversial because of the sexual aspect, but I can remember that case, trying to process that case myself, how, strange and bizarre and unlikely that type of thing was. But at the same time, the guy seemed to be vetted very well, and it came out looking pretty credible. And
there was a very credible researcher that was way ahead of his time. I forgot his name. Do you remember who he was,
Dr.
Mike, down there?
Dr. Olavio Fontes.
Alfonso?
Yeah, he died under strange conditions, didn't he? And he was one of the first ones to say that there seemed to be a plasmoid around these crafts as they move through the atmosphere.
That's unfortunate. Yeah, a lot of strange deaths in this field as I've been looking into it, which is
yeah, that's another subject, particularly down in Brazil. There's a lot of stuff.
So we kind of got a good grasp of like what got you guys both into the field, and we kind of got a little bit into the Operation Right to Know from Ed. Can we get your perspective, Mike, on when the Operation Right to Know really started to develop, and when you met Ed and the Bill Moore connection, and just kind of going from
Bill Moore had a magazine called Focus, and in 1991 I wrote an essay there, which he published. I knew him a little bit and had the previous year visited with him at some length in San Francisco, before he gave a talk. He and I walked around for a few hours, and I got to know him, a little bit from that and prior phone conversations. So I wrote about the idea of political activism in an essay that got published in Bill Moore's Focus magazine in 1991. And I got a letter from some people, including Ed, and from that we started talking on the phone. And Ed came up with the name Operation Right to Know, and I think we started planning for an educational display at the White House, which we did have in March of 1992. There was this very long table with all sorts of literature and material, and Ed created this very long, beautiful banner, which you could see from the Oval Office.
Oh, cool.
Oh, yeah, we were at 0 Point, got a permit for us to have the display at 0 Point on the ellipse. So in the background behind us was the Washington Monument, and right in front of us was, the fence for the back lawn of the White House where the pond is and where the helicopter comes and go, and where George H.W. Bush would walk his dogs.
Yeah,
so
MUFON and MUFON put Mike in that on that banner and everything on the front of their journal after that. And I think Larry Bryant, Bryant was involved.
That it actually helped enable us to have a demonstration at the White House just a year later.
Larry Bryant helped us out a lot because I was already corresponding with Larry Bryant for several years by snail mail and by phone, and he was instrumental in getting the press releases out 2 weeks ahead of time for the 93. Before the demonstration, getting in 2 weeks ahead of time was really important with the Washington Post first article. Even though it was obfuscated to a certain degree, it got I think Sonia, whatever her name was, in CNN. And so on my way to the demonstration, I think I stopped in Atlanta and was interviewed with her there, and Bruce Maccabee was interviewed remotely, I think. And I think before that I even got some on CBS's Up to the Minute at night. And so we got quite a lot of press coverage ahead of time, which really helped build the press interest in whatever. So we had a lot of press.
Thank you, Myron. Welcome back. And now for something completely different. Does the United States government bury reports of unidentified flying object? Ed Komarek says yes, and that's why he helped start a group called Operation Right to Know.
Among the believers who'll be taking a message to the White House next week is South Georgia farmer Ed Komarek, who's founder of a group called Operation Right to Know.
Yeah. And so what happened was that we were set up 93, so we decided to wait later and do it on July 3rd, right before July 4th, where there wouldn't be too much news for the press. And it turned out that it was really hot, and I'm trying to think of his name, set up a bandstand and with music and everything across from the White House there, where we all gathered.
I give you Hal McKenzie, our Master of Ceremonies. Let's give him a hand.
Here's the script.
You know, there have been many demonstrations in Washington, D.C., small ones, monstrous ones, but I'll tell you, this one is the most important one. Yeah. Woo. Doesn't matter how big it is, this one is more important than any demonstration that's ever been held in Washington, D.C. Because this is something that affects everybody in the United States. It affects your children and your children's children. It affects everybody in the whole world.
And then we went out in front of the White House and with the banners and signs and everything else.
The parade marshal will give you instructions. You'll pick up signs and you'll march in front of the White House. And then you'll come back and we'll have political speeches, we'll have great entertainment.
Yeah, we got Associated Press about 2 weeks ahead of time, which is instrumental in a lot of the press that we got, because even though he tried to obfuscate the facts, like saying that we were looking for 20,000 UFO government documents that would prove the cover-up, when we were saying we had 20,000 UFO documents that prove a cover-up. And so he was deliberately obfuscating, and Lane Douglas ran into problems with him too later in other demonstrations. And then at the demonstration side, he was really kind of freaked out and running around. He finally found one kind of silly encounter case or whatever, and tacked that on to his main article that went out in the New York Times and major newspapers all over the country. And a lot of the major newspapers saw how the silly part of it at the end used to try and discredit us, and they dropped that. And so that was good. And we got so much press coverage here and around the world that Frank Drank with the SETI program had to come out and debunk us that night at 3 o'clock in the morning. And one of the reasons, another reason I got good CNN coverage was I had a friend in Tallahassee who was a friend of John Holman, the reporter for CNN that was, at the first Iraq War, when the missiles were coming in the Iraq War, who was interested. And so he gave us he was there with the camera and whatever, and gave us good coverage on CNN.
Despite merciless heat, some 100 people marched in a circle in front of the White House today. Their demand, respect for their cause. One claims first-hand knowledge of extraterrestrial life. Another says she's seen a flying saucer. All want more reports of full disclosure of close encounters with UFOs. CNN's John Holloman has the story.
If this group of 100 demonstrators is correct, the U.S. government is covering up the most important secret of all time: alien beings who have made contact with Earthlings.
People or whatever actually going out in front of the White House with the banner and signs and stuff demonstrating in the UFO cover-up, and Roswell and signs that we had all made up and whatever. And that, I don't know if that image was picked up in the New York Times or not, but later we had a GAO demonstration that Lane Douglas headed up, that I wasn't involved in it, but the New York Times was there, and they took a photograph there that they still use for UFO articles that they're putting out, and they're no longer debunking the subject and are actually, with Leslie Kean and whatever, actually helping to to end the cover-up.
Well, I got
trouble.
I got footage of our speakers, which I don't know if you've seen, Red, but
I've seen it all. I saw everything on your
I
channel.
I think the best quote was Jim Mosley saying, "You all need a lot more people, to meet your goal."
Out of the heat and all, and I am with you in spirit, but you'll need more people, and you will need a lot more people to really make any difference. Now, the Gays have had problems for many years. I'm from Key West, Florida. I take those problems somewhat seriously. Well, they got 1 million people out here. I think the government's starting to take them seriously, but with the Clinton administration, they may get somewhere.
The UFO thing has been a relatively small hardcore for many, many years. I've been part of it for 40 years, so I'm not speaking as an outsider. I wish you well. I am with you in spirit, but it will take time and patience, and you may not get what you want very soon. But good luck, and God bless. Thank you. All right.
And I think about that a lot because, you know, during this latest wave of interest, which started, you know, in December 2017, it doesn't seem like the public has really gotten all fired up on this subject. Of course, there's a lot of distractions or heavy issues that take our attention and energy, but nevertheless, even though there has been, of course, a firing up of interest among members of Congress, which is good, and among within.
Actually, there's a lot, Mike. Even the bulldozer operator and people here in my local area and whatever have heard about the UAP and and the government, coming out with all that or whatever. So it is quite a lot of news coverage, not just in the New York Times, but it's picked up in other news outlets.
A lot more respectful. I did see the who was it? Rush also had a little segment after your guys' event.
Yeah, Rush. Yeah.
Over the weekend, massive protests. You can tell in our society there are a lot of people with nothing to do. You can tell that there are a lot of people with too much time on their hands. There was a protest in Washington over the weekend, a protest of people, by people, who want more information about UFOs. This is Operation Right to Know. And there's a picture of these people. When I first saw this, I thought it was another gay rights march in D.C., and then I looked closer and found out that it could have been. We, on this program, on my radio show, have a strict rule. There are several types of calls that we will never accept. And number one on the list is UFO types.
Yeah, there was a segment on that, and then there was an interview on CNN that Mike's got there somewhere where Elaine Douglas and I were both talking to a CNN reporter or somebody or whatever. I don't know if you saw that one.
The United States government has orchestrated the most spectacular deception of a people in the history of the world. The reason we're out here today is because we want to bring it to an end. We want President Clinton to tell the public the truth about UFOs.
We're not trying to tell people what to believe. We're just trying to get people to look at the evidence.
Yeah, I saw that one. That's the best clipping, I think, of it. That one CNN piece where it's you and her talking, and then respectful.
Yeah,
they kind of throw a little bit of a joke, I felt like, but it wasn't like the Rush piece. Or even Sonia was kind of, when I rewatched it, she seemed kind of dismissive, which was the norm then.
Welcome back. UFOs, the government keeping documents secret, proving that there were UFOs that landed on this country? I don't know. Well, I'm not sure whether or not information is really being collected. I've looked at a number of the documents that, frankly, are very hazy in terms of what they say. But you've got guys like Ed Komarek out here. You don't need the government, Mr. Maccabee. You could just round up guys like Ed, ask them a variety of questions, and test the veracity. For example, how would you know if what Ed reported was the truth, or, frankly, a figment of his imagination, or something else out there?
Well, I presume if it were just Mr. Komarek making a sighting report, I probably wouldn't be extremely interested in the subject. Sorry, Ed, but, that's the way it goes.
Yeah. And Bruce McAwee interviewed him remotely, I think, at the Sonia interview. And he kind of put us down a little bit, but it was okay. And, as you know, Bruce McAbee's been involved for a long time and has funded UFO research and whatever. But he's played both sides of the fence that I found out later.
Well, that's something that's important to, I think it's important to note that a lot of people in the UFO field were nervous. When I told Walt Andrews that I got a permit for a demonstration at the White House the day after his MUFON conference ended in Richmond, Virginia, nearby. That's how I figured we could get some. And his reaction was, "Oh dear."
Oh yeah.
And Walt Andrews and all of them got all kind of intelligence connections and whatever. And I'd already summarized by that time that Walt Andrews and the top MUFON people were just following up with what Hynek had done. Keyhole was a straightforward, honest, and NICAP were straightforward and honest. Larry Bryant was involved way back then in the 1950s. But then the CIA destroyed NICAP. And even Hillenkotter, the head of the CIA, first head of the CIA, was on that NICAP board and everything and involved with it. But then when Hynek came in as a debunker, all of a sudden he changed his stripes and started, instead of debunking, saying this is a scientific problem and we got to concentrate as a scientific problem, and started building an intelligence gathering network, public intelligence gathering network. But the really good cases were going up to MUFON, but they weren't coming back down. All you were getting was a lot of sightings reports and whatnot. And I even talked to Lynn Stringfield over the phone, and he said, Lynn Stringfield was a crash retrieval specialist at the time, and he said that at a meeting that he had, that Hynek thought he had crash debris and was going to come out of it, and he had Air Force personnel in that meeting that were going to physically take it away from, confiscate it from Lynn Springfield, that he found out later from Hynek himself. And so a lot of these guys were playing both sides of the fence, and Bruce Maccabee was the same way, in that Bruce Maccabee was involved, with the Department of Naval in the Navy, up there up in Washington. Bruce Maccabee is just like Dr. Hynek's been playing both sides of the fence. Some people are completely on our side, like Lynn Stringfield and others, but a lot of the public people are playing both sides. Even Bill Moore got caught up in all that, involved in the Benowitz case, because they were running psychological operations against Benowitz.
I got a story about that. I would talk, since the late 80s, I would probably talk to Bill Moore maybe once every month or so to go over Barry Greenwood's latest critique of the MJ-12 papers, because I would get that in the Just Cause newsletter from Barry Greenwood. And Moore was, pretty much not on the defensive. He would, go over the points about whatever was his latest point about the MJ-12 papers. So one time before I called him up, and he was in the midst of writing that speech that he would give at the MUFON conference in Las Vegas in 1989. And so he described to me in detail what he was going to say in that speech. And one of the images that I remember is him telling me that Benowitz would sit there chain smoking, totally obsessed with the ideas, and Bill Moore was trying to tell him that everything that he believed and was being told by, Doty and the people at Kirtland Air Force Base was a bunch of bull. Benowitz, of course, was stubborn and held on to his concepts of what was going on. But
wow, that's some interesting history, UFO history. You heard the speech before he gave it, the infamous speech.
So I was briefed on what he was going to say in his speech. So I called up Walt Andrews and said, Walt, Bill Moore tells me he's going to say this, and that at the conference, and Walt didn't believe me. He did. Of course, he believed me later.
Back to the Operation Right to Know. So it sounds like you guys are very successful, especially for like the 90s, in terms of getting press on this subject. And I was wondering if you guys had thought about, because I personally think there's a through line from that 93 event to even what we're seeing today with Clinton, Hillary, Podesta. You know what I mean? I feel like, because that was
I dealt with Lawrence. I dealt with Lawrence Rockefeller through his right hand man. And so I had some connections with all that.
Oh, yeah. The Rockefellers Lawrence was very interested, and there's that famous picture that I'll put up with Lawrence walking with Hillary Clinton reading that UFO book.
Yeah. Lawrence is a good guy. Now, the other Rockefellers are a problem. And I had a guy with Army intelligence who said Nelson Rockefeller was very involved. And so, you have to understand that as Elizondo realizes that private industry co-opted this way back starting in the 1950s, really, and took it over unconstitutionally and illegally, and even criminal-wise. And that's another reason why those that are involved, are fighting the cover-up.
Yeah, and he's basically made that point too. And there's going to be like lawsuits, like Company A got access to this for 50 years and has been able to make this money.
Let's say, I've said this before, let's say you have two competing companies. You have Aerospace Company A and Aerospace Company B. And Aerospace Company A, for whatever reason, gets a favor and some sort of really exotic, game-changing material is provided to that company to do an analysis. Meanwhile, Company B, who is competing fairly, doesn't get that material. Turns out Company A now starts getting a lot of contracts, defense contracts, and becomes a multi-billion-dollar company, while Company B, who never had the advantage of having that material, goes into bankruptcy. Hundreds of people lose their jobs, and stockholders lose their investment. Keeping in mind that both companies are supposed to be treated fairly and have fair competition when it comes to U.S. government contracts. Now what? Now what happens? Where's the liability?
But and yeah, back to my point earlier a little bit. I was just saying, I think like Operation Right to Know, I think is very important, especially like in the 90s. But even in the bigger like post 40s UFO America history, but just especially in the 90s, how the beginning of the Clinton presidency, you had this big, and not the biggest, but it did make international news, or it made CNN. You know what I mean? So it's at least
we had to make a statement. Yeah, I had to make a statement, and also what people don't realize is that it stimulated a lot of interest in the press with sightings and X-Files and all that kind of stuff. They even used some of my material in one X-File case that they used.
Really?
Alien on Ice was based on a case I was involved in.
Case on Ice? That was very nice.
Yeah, so we had a lot of impact, and I would really like to see somebody like yourself that's well connected to really reorganize and do demonstrations again in Washington D.C.
Yeah, and I was talking to you and Mike about the 30-year anniversary of the bigger march is next year, July. So it sounds like it'd be a perfect time to do it, if anything. You know what I mean? If there ever was a time. 30-year anniversary.
Yeah, we're just waiting for you. We're just waiting for you. Yeah, we're just waiting for you young folks to just take it over and move on with it.
Oh, and then I was also going to say the whole the Roswell Air Force thing in the 90s. I feel like you guys might have even had some impetus in like getting them to re-release, or where they said it was the Mogul leather balloon, right? Where they changed their story on since 47, and then they said it was another different kind of weather balloon. So.
Lynn Russell, CNN Headline News. Half a century ago, residents near Roswell, New Mexico reported a UFO crash. Today, the Air Force released a report suggesting any sightings of so-called aliens were test dummies dropped from weather balloons.
The story has been out there for 50 years. Now the Air Force has issued a new report about what really fell from the sky in the New Mexico desert in 1947. The Air Force says it was not extraterrestrial.
What doesn't fit, say UFO believers, is that Roswell was in 1947 and the first dummy test was conducted in 1953.
I don't know why they can't associate that time period. I'm sorry, I just don't have any information for that.
Basically, I just guess my point of view is you guys had a big impact in terms of 90s ufology, and I think Bill Clinton getting the door shut on him helped inspire him.
I got a letter from 13-year-old Ryan from Belfast. Now, Ryan, if you're out in the crowd tonight, here's the answer to your question. No. As far as I know, an alien spacecraft did not crash in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. And Ryan, if the United States Air Force did recover alien bodies, they didn't tell me about it either, and I want to know.
And Podesta to like get to where we are today, because people may not like them. People like the Clintons. They hate Trump. They love Trump. But Podesta is really interested in this subject, and you can see the through line basically.
I was going to say, I have a question from a patron named Call Me Ishmael, and he was just wondering how you guys feel the media coverage on this subject has changed. Like, it's clearly better, especially when you look at, like, the Rush Limbaugh video. But, yeah, how do you guys feel? Do you guys feel vindicated? Are you happy? You think there's still more to go?
It changed almost overnight for some reason. I have no idea why all of a sudden it changed, because the New York Times, Washington AP, the Washington Post, everybody was following some kind of a script in trying to suppress or us, and it was obvious to me with the Associated Press article, and so I don't know exactly what happened, but it seemed like almost overnight. Before Luisano came out, whatever, there was and the New York Times article came out, on UAP, that something somewhere had changed as far as the official.
Don't forget, you mentioned the Podesta line, the effect Podesta's had on this. And he was chief of staff for Barack Obama, who is one of the several key people lately who have said astonishing things about all of this, along with James Clapper and John Brennan. And
why did all of a sudden they change their tune, though, Mike? It's just like all of a sudden they changed their tune. You go all the way back to the head of the NSA. What was the name that came out?
That's what I read might have identified the factor there being Podesta's influence.
You think it's
Podesta? Because Barack Obama is one of those that's saying that we got something here that's real.
But what is true, and I'm actually being serious here, is that there's footage and records of objects in the skies that we don't know exactly what they are. We can't explain how they moved, their trajectory. They did not have an easily explainable pattern.
And, the CIA directors that I just mentioned.
The only reason to me, for classification would be if there's some sensitive method that data relating to so-called UFOs was collected. But other than that, I don't know why we haven't been more transparent about it in the past, and I'm part of that crime, I guess. And my former capacities were, I didn't insist on more transparency with respect to this issue.
Yeah, but they only talked about it after the New York Times article came out. So I'm just wondering why suddenly the New York Times went from debunking an order and to do a positive UAP case and accept Leslie Keenan's
input. But it seems like the New York Times, with a new crew of editors, has gone back to just simply ignoring the subject. So, but that's been noticeable too, by the way.
Just about almost wrapping up. So maybe if I could get like a statement from each of you, just a closing statement, some thoughts on Operation Right to Know, and just looking forward. Just quick, concise. Just what do you guys want the people to know? We'll start with Mike.
Oh, okay.
And also, Mike, if you want to talk about your website a bit too. Sorry.
Okay, that's Cosmic Pluralism Studies website. Both basically focuses on cases of close encounters of the third and fourth kind. Since I was kind of affected early on by the Lorenzans and their emphasis on those types of cases, I guess I consider them to be kind of very important. Anyway, as far as the disclosure activity and activism, it still seems like to me that there needs to be more intense signs of public interest. And right now, the public doesn't seem to have gravitated towards this as something to focus on to any significant degree. So any type of future activism has to kind of cultivate and help develop, some sort of public response or interest or signs of it, which I really haven't seen yet. Though I know, Ed, you did mention something anecdotally, that interactions locally there that seem to indicate greater signs of interest, but it just seems like people aren't really necessarily willing to go beyond the type of lobbying efforts that others do, like Chris and Mellon and Lou Elizondo are engaged in.
Yeah, Mike and I were talking about that, and there's a fear factor, and probably part of it is the fear factor that people have.
That and it's would be low on the totem pole as far as where they would bring your attention and energy to.
Yeah, when it happens, it's going to, it's going to completely transform everything. Especially if there's a surge, if there's an increase in disclosure and everything just all gets dumped out, onto the public domain, and then it could create really a lot of chaos, and change. And so that's why they're trying to do this gradual disclosure, and you don't know at what point. It's kind of like trying to use prescribed fire out in the western United States, and then having the prescribed fire get away from you and turn into a wildfire and burn everything up that you're trying to protect. Yeah, and at the same time, then you have the special interests that are responsible, the criminals that are responsible for, taking this over and unconstitutional. Larry Sheehan is, pointing out, and whatever, and Lou Elizondo all understand and whatever, and they're not helping anything at all because they're trying to, keep it slowed down as much as they possibly, can for their own special interests, and for the liability issues that come up with all this. So it's a big can of worms. It's all going to be dumped, one way or the other into the public domain to deal with, And so I hate to see, a catastrophic disclosure, but, if they don't handle it properly, you get the same kind of situation as a prescribed fire getting away and turning into a wildfire. It's like you have this accumulation of fuel in the forest because there's no light fires in the forest to keep the fuel loads down. It's the same way you build up this field of lies that then the truth gets into it, and then the field of lies gets blown out, very suddenly and whatever, and it's extremely disruptive to society.
Yep. Yeah, I get the sense that the public really would prefer that this matter stays covert, in the shadows.
Yeah, they're still in denial. Yeah, they're still in denial, and it scares them.
There's a potential for a lot of psychological discomfort, I think.
Operation Right to Know may not have had the impact many involved had hoped for, but I think it is still a significant part of UFO history. Along with the rally held in July of 1993, Operation Right to Know would hold demonstrations in front of Parliament in the UK, and held demonstrations in front of the General Accounting Office in support of New Mexico Congressman Stephen Schiff, who was actively requesting information on the Roswell crash.
General Accounting Office is looking into the July 1947 crash retrieval of a disc and alien beings that occurred in July of 1947. Congressman Schiff from New Mexico has been asking the General Accounting Office to investigate the crash because there's been a big cover-up about it for many years.
Because of the pressure from Congressman Stephen Schiff, President Bill Clinton, and I like to think the efforts of Operation Right to Know, the Air Force would release 2 reports on what they claimed really crashed in Roswell in 1947. The Air Force report did not confirm aliens, but it did do some pretty significant things. Firstly, the report confirms that the original weather balloon cover story, which had been the official narrative for 50 years, was in fact a lie, introducing the mogul balloon to the Roswell equation. The 97 report also introduces the concept of bodies to the official narrative with the mention of crash dummies, and invites a discrepancy in that the subject dummies were not in use until the 1950s, and the Roswell crash occurred in 1947.
2 dummies testing parachutes.
Typical test dummy used by the Air Force during the 1950s.
The Air Force showed movies of crash test dummies, insisting this is what people saw when they reported alien bodies in a flying saucer over Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. Skeptics immediately pointed out the dummies were used 10 years after the Roswell sightings.
But I think if you find that people talk about things over a period of time, they begin to lose exactly when the date was.
These discrepancies and inconsistencies are important data points that help each of us develop our own understanding of Roswell and the US government's varying stances on UFOs, especially when considering recent UFO developments. Operation Right to Know would exist until the year 2000, when it was disbanded. I think we can admire and respect the efforts they put in and the ability to garner positive press during that time, and I do think they played a huge part in the Air Force releasing their reports on Roswell, something to be proud of. Thanks again to Ed Komarek and Mike Jamieson for the interview and sharing their history about Operation Right to Know. Links to their works and their recommended readings are in the description. I highly recommend, if you made it this far in the video, that you take a second to write your elected officials a quick letter supporting the recent UFO efforts in Congress and the Department of Defense. It would be a great way to honor the memory of Operation Right to Know, especially those participants that are no longer with us. And perhaps there will be another Operation Right to Know march in DC one day.